The crackling voice cut through static at 19:04 Eastern Standard Time. All planes close up tight. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together. Then silence. 14 men and 5 torpedo bombers swallowed by darkness over the Atlantic, never to be seen again. What happened on December 5th, 1945, would become one of aviation's most enduring mysteries, spawning decades of theories, investigations, and legends that continue to captivate the world today. The morning had dawned crisp and clear over Naval Air Station in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Salt air mixed with the acrid bite of high-octane aviation fuel as ground crews prepared 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers for what should have been a routine training flight. The date, December 5th, 1945, marked just 93 days since Japan's surrender aboard the USS Missouri. America was finally at peace, but the military machine still churned, processing the final waves of wartime pilots through accelerated training programs. At 14:10 Eastern Standard Time, 5 Avengers designated Flight 19 lifted off from Fort Lauderdale's runway. Their massive Wright R2000, 600 radial engines filling the humid air with a deep, chest-rattling growl that pilots called the Cyclone's War Song. Each aircraft carried 300 gallons of aviation gasoline, enough for 6 hours of flight time. The sweet, acrid smell of fuel exhaust lingered in their wake as they climbed into partly cloudy skies, temperature holding steady at 67 degrees Fahrenheit. Leading this formation was Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor, a 28-year-old combat veteran with over 2,500 flight hours logged in his record books. Behind him flew 4 student pilots, averaging just 300 total hours each, most with only 60 hours in Avenger cockpits. These men represented the tail end of wartime's accelerated pipeline, pushed through training at breakneck speed to meet the Pacific War's insatiable demand for aircrew. Their mission, designated Navigation Problem Number 1, was meant to be their final practice flight before graduation. The planned route formed a triangle over the Atlantic, 141 miles east to the Hen and Chicken Shoals, 73 miles north, then 140 miles southwest back to base. It was a track flown countless times before, designed to mimic the kind of overwater navigation required for Pacific carrier strikes. The Avenger itself was a proven workhorsey single-engine torpedo bomber that had helped win the Pacific War. Each aircraft bristled with defensive machine guns and could carry a Mark 13 torpedo or 2,000 pounds of bombs. But on this December afternoon, they flew clean, carrying only fuel, crew, and the weight of expectations. These pilots needed just one more successful flight to earn their wings and join the ranks of qualified torpedo bomber crews. Base life at Fort Lauderdale had been Spartan throughout the war years. 3,600 personnel crammed into plywood barracks, enduring Florida's humid heat, while rotating through 4-hour sessions in link trainers' dark black boxes, where they practiced instrument flying by, following glowing needles in pitch darkness. Live flights often stretched into dusk, testing pilots' ability to navigate by dead reckoning when landmarks disappeared into shadow. The statistics were sobering. From 1942 to 1946, 94 men had died in Avenger training accidents at this single base. Flight 19's 14 crew members would soon join that grim tally, becoming the final and most infamous casualties of the program. But none of them knew that yet. At 14:10, as their landing gear retracted and Fort Lauderdale fell away beneath them, they were simply 5 crews executing a routine navigation exercise over familiar waters. The Atlantic stretched endlessly ahead, its surface painted in shades of blue and green that shifted with the moving clouds above. Weather reports called for mild conditions with puffy cumulus clouds scattered across their route. Perfect flying weather for a graduation flight. Perfect conditions for what should have been an unremarkable afternoon that ended with 5 Avengers touching down safely at Fort Lauderdale, their crews one step closer to earning their coveted wings. After reading that opening, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching this from, and what time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you're intrigued by this mystery, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most compelling unsolved cases. Instead, Flight 19 was about to become the center of the largest peacetime search and rescue operation in Navy history. Something would go catastrophically wrong in the skies over the Bermuda Triangle, turning a routine training flight into a mystery that still defies explanation today. But what exactly happened after those 5 Avengers disappeared beyond the horizon? The 5 Avengers banked eastward in perfect formation, their shadows racing across whitecaps as they climbed to 8,000 feet, enough to spot landmarks, low enough to read the ocean's mood below. This wasn't just another training flight. It was the culmination of months of intensive preparation that would determine whether these student pilots earned their wings or washed out of the program entirely. Lieutenant Taylor's voice crackled through the radio as he established formation discipline, his 4 wingmen tucking in tight behind the lead aircraft. Each TBM Avenger carried a crew of 3: pilot, radio man gunner, and turret gunner, though today the rear positions were filled by students rotating through different training roles. The aircraft themselves were mechanical marvels, 40-foot wingspan, supporting 12,000 pounds of military precision, powered by engines that could push them to 270 miles per hour in level flight. Their navigation equipment was surprisingly primitive by modern standards. Each Avenger carried 2 magnetic compasses mounted in the cockpit, but no LORAN navigation system, no GPS, no electronic aids beyond basic radio equipment. Dead reckoning was their primary tool, calculating position based on heading, airspeed, and elapsed time, then cross-checking with visual landmarks and radio bearings from known stations. It was the same method mariners had used for centuries, adapted for an age of aviation where a few degrees of error could mean the difference between landfall and open ocean. The flight plan seemed straightforward enough. Navigation problem number 1 called for a due east heading to the Hen and Chicken Shoals, a series of shallow reefs and sandbars that served as a perfect checkpoint roughly 141 miles from Fort Lauderdale. From there, they would turn north for 73 miles before making the final southwestern leg, Homea Triangle, that would test their ability to maintain precise headings over featureless water. This particular route held special significance in Navy training doctrine. The triangle pattern mimicked the kind of extended overwater navigation required for Pacific carrier operations, where pilots might fly hundreds of miles from their ship to strike distant targets before finding their way home to a moving flight deck. With the war just ended, these skills remained critically important as America maintained its naval presence across vast Pacific distances. Taylor himself embodied the transition from wartime urgency to peacetime precision. Born in 1917, he had already served 2 combat tours in the Pacific, flying Grumman F-4F Wildcats and later F-6F Hellcats off various carriers. His logbook recorded 2,500 flight hours accumulated across 3 years of intensive combat operations experience that should have made him the ideal instructor for inexperienced student pilots. But combat flying and navigation training required different skill sets. In the Pacific, Taylor had operated as part of large formations with dedicated navigation aircraft and comprehensive radio support. Task force operations provided multiple backup systems and constant communication with the carrier. Training flights over Florida's coast demanded more individual responsibility, with pilots expected to navigate independently, using only basic instruments and dead reckoning techniques. The student pilots following Taylor represented the war's final production run young men who had entered training just as victory became assured. Unlike earlier classes driven by immediate combat necessity, these pilots faced a more relaxed timeline but also reduced resources as the military began its massive demobilization. Average flight time for student pilots had dropped significantly from wartime peaks, forcing instructors to pack essential skills into compressed training schedules. At 14:30, 20 minutes into the flight, Fort Lauderdale's coastline had already faded into haze behind them. The Atlantic stretched in all directions, its surface marked only by the occasional white cap and the distant smudge of a merchant vessel following the coastal shipping lanes. Weather remained favorable, scattered cumulus clouds, casting moving shadows across the water, visibility extending for miles in all directions. Radio chatter between the aircraft remained routine. Student pilots practiced standard communication procedures, while Taylor monitored their formation flying and navigation progress. Each crew member was expected to maintain independent navigation plots, cross-checking their calculations against the formation leader's course. It was methodical, repetitive work that built the muscle memory essential for combat operations. The Avengers themselves flew with the distinctive sound that had become synonymous with American naval aviation. The Wright R-2000 600 Cyclone engines produced a deep, rhythmic rumble that pilots claimed they could feel in their bones. Exhaust stacks glowed cherry red in the slipstream, while the smell of high-octane fuel mixed with hot metal and hydraulic fluid sensations that marked these aircraft as products of America's wartime industrial might. Below them, the ocean began to show subtle signs of change. What had started as gentle swells now carried more definition, suggesting weather systems moving in from the northeast. Cumulus clouds that had appeared innocent at takeoff were beginning to build vertical development, their tops reaching higher into the atmosphere where upper-level winds could tear them apart or build them into towering thunderheads. But at 14:30, these changes remained minor. Flight 19 continued eastward toward their first checkpoint, maintaining perfect formation as they approached the Hen and Chicken Shoals. Navigation calculations showed them on track and on schedule for what should have been a textbook training mission. Yet something was already going wrong, something that wouldn't become apparent until they reached their turning point and attempted to navigate home. What would happen next would transform a routine training exercise into one of aviation's greatest unsolved mysteries. At 15:15, the scattered reefs of Hen and Chicken Shoals materialized through the haze-dark patches of coral and sand that should have marked Flight 19's successful completion of the first leg. Instead, they became the last reliable landmark these 14 men would ever see. This checkpoint represented more than just a navigation milestone. It was the moment when routine training was supposed to transform into triumph, proving these student pilots ready for fleet assignment. Lieutenant Taylor's voice came through the radio with practiced authority as he identified the shoals below. The shallow water revealed itself in brilliant turquoise against the deeper Atlantic blue, exactly where their dead reckoning calculations had predicted. For a brief moment, navigation problem number 1 was proceeding exactly according to plan. Each student pilot marked the time 15:15 Eastern Standard Time and noted their position for the northward turn that would take them along the Bahamas' western edge. The second leg called for a heading of approximately due north, covering 73 miles of open water before turning southwest toward home. It was during this segment that navigation became more challenging, as the flight would be operating beyond visual range of any major landmarks, relying entirely on compass headings and time-distance calculations. The Bahama Islands lay somewhere to their east, but at their planned altitude and distance, those islands would remain below the horizon. Taylor executed the turn with military precision, his 4 wingmen following in tight formation as they settled onto their new northbound heading. The Avengers climbed slightly to take advantage of favorable winds, their engines maintaining steady power settings that would optimize fuel consumption for the longer legs ahead. Each aircraft carried enough fuel for 6 hours of flight time, more than sufficient for the planned 3-hour exercise, with comfortable reserves for unexpected delays or navigation corrections. But the weather was beginning to change in ways that the morning forecast hadn't predicted. What had started as scattered cumulus clouds at 8,000 feet were building into towering cumulus formations, their tops reaching well above the flight's cruising altitude. More concerning were the darker clouds building to the northeast, signs of a fast-moving frontal system that could bring sudden changes in wind direction and visibility. The student pilots had trained extensively for weather recognition and avoidance, but classroom instruction couldn't fully prepare them for the Atlantic's sudden mood swings. Tropical and subtropical weather patterns could develop with remarkable speed, turning benign flying conditions into serious challenges within minutes. Wind shear, embedded thunderstorms, and sudden visibility reductions were all hazards that required immediate recognition and appropriate response. At 15:45, 30 minutes into the northbound leg, the first signs of trouble began to manifest. Radio communications between the aircraft started showing intermittent interference static bursts and distorted transmissions that suggested atmospheric disturbances. Cuban radio stations operating on similar frequencies began bleeding through with Spanish-language broadcasts that further complicated communication within the formation. The compass systems in Taylor's aircraft were also beginning to show irregularities. The magnetic compass, which should have provided a steady northbound reference, appeared to be fluctuating slightly. While compass variations were not uncommon over water magnetic declination and local anomalies could affect readings, the fluctuations seemed more pronounced than normal. The backup compass in Taylor's aircraft was showing similar instabilities, creating doubt about their true heading. These mechanical issues, while concerning, weren't necessarily catastrophic. Experienced pilots routinely dealt with compass problems by cross-referencing multiple navigation sources and relying on dead reckoning techniques. But for student pilots operating in deteriorating weather conditions, instrument anomalies could quickly compound into serious navigation errors. The psychological pressure was also beginning to build. These student pilots had invested months of intensive training to reach this point, with graduation and fleet assignment hanging in the balance. A failed training flight could mean recycling through additional instruction, or in worst cases, elimination from the program entirely. The weight of expectations, both personal and institutional, added stress to what should have been a routine exercise. Taylor's combat experience, which should have been an asset, may have actually complicated the situation. Pacific theater operations had trained him to rely on different navigation methods and support systems that weren't available during training flights. Carrier-based operations provided radar tracking, radio direction finding, and coordination with other aircraft that created multiple backup systems. Solo navigation over the Atlantic required different skills and created different psychological pressures. At 1600 hours, as they approached the scheduled turning point for their southwest leg home, the weather situation had deteriorated significantly. What the morning forecast had described as scattered clouds had evolved into a complex system of towering cumulus and building thunderstorms. Visibility, which had been excellent at takeoff, was now reduced by haze and scattered precipitation. Wind speeds were increasing, creating turbulence that made precise formation flying more challenging. The radio chatter between aircraft reflected growing uncertainty. Student pilots were reporting compass fluctuations and requesting navigation updates from their formation leader. The clean, confident communications of the first hour were giving way to hesitant questions and repeated requests for clarification. But the most ominous sign was yet to come. As Flight 19 prepared to execute their final turn toward Fort Lauderdale, Lieutenant Taylor would make a radio transmission that revealed the full scope of their emerging crisis. What he was about to report would transform a routine training flight into a desperate struggle for survival land, launch one of the greatest search and rescue operations in naval history. At 1611 Eastern Standard Time, Lieutenant Taylor's voice cut through the growing static with words that would haunt naval aviation history. Both my compasses are out. I'm sure I'm in the Keys. This single transmission revealed that Flight 19 had suffered a complete navigation failure at the worst possible moment, trapped between deteriorating weather and the approaching darkness of a December evening. The implications were staggering. Without reliable compass readings, the 5 Avengers were essentially flying blind over hundreds of square miles of open ocean. Dead reckoning navigation depended entirely on accurate compass headings. Lose that reference point, and even the most experienced pilot could become hopelessly lost within minutes. For student pilots with limited overwater experience, compass failure represented a near catastrophic emergency. Taylor's reference to the Keys suggested he believed Flight 19 had somehow drifted far south of their intended track, possibly over the Florida Keys archipelago that stretched southwest from the mainland. But this assessment made no navigational sense, given their planned route and elapsed flight time. If accurate, it would mean they had deviated by more than 100 miles from their intended course, an error of such magnitude that it defied explanation. The weather was rapidly becoming a factor equal to their navigation crisis. What had started as scattered cumulus clouds at takeoff had evolved into a complex frontal system that meteorologists would later describe as unusually severe for early December. Fast-moving squall lines were now driving 40-mile-per-hour winds at 1,000 feet altitude, creating turbulence that made formation flying increasingly difficult. At 8,000 feet, where Flight 19 was operating, Wind speeds had reached 75 miles per hour, strong enough to blow the formation significantly off course, if not properly compensated. Visibility was deteriorating as scattered precipitation and atmospheric haze reduced the distance pilots could see in any direction. Landmarks that should have been clearly visible from their altitude were now obscured by weather, eliminating the visual references that might have helped resolve their navigation crisis. The ocean below had transformed from the benign blue-green of morning into a gray-white expanse of whitecaps and spray that offered no navigational clues. Radio communications were also becoming increasingly problematic. Cuban radio stations, operating on frequencies close to those used by military aircraft, were creating interference that garbled transmissions between the Avengers. Spanish-language broadcasts, mixed with static and atmospheric noise, forcing pilots to repeat messages multiple times before achieving clear communication. This interference wasn't unusual over the Florida Straits, but it added another layer of difficulty to an already complex situation. The psychological pressure within the formation was becoming palpable. Student pilots who had entered the flight confident in their abilities were now faced with a crisis that exceeded their training and experience. Radio chatter reflected growing anxiety as crew members attempted to reconcile conflicting compass readings with their dead reckoning calculations. The clean, professional communications of earlier in the flight were giving way to hesitant questions and requests for repeated instructions. One transmission captured the growing desperation within the formation. An anxious voice later, determined to be one of the student pilots, came through the static. "If we could just fly west, we'd get home." The suggestion was logical from a survival standpoint. Florida lay to the west, and westward flight would eventually reach landfall regardless of their exact position. But Navy training protocols required student pilots to follow their formation leader's instructions, even in emergency situations. This protocol created a tragic paradox. Lieutenant Taylor, despite his extensive combat experience, was operating with faulty instruments and making navigation decisions based on potentially incorrect position estimates. The student pilots, who might have had different ideas about their location, were bound by military discipline to follow his lead. Chain of command and formation integrity principles that had served naval aviation well throughout the war were now potentially preventing the flight from taking actions that might save their lives. The Avenger aircraft themselves were performing flawlessly despite the deteriorating conditions. The Wright R2600 engines continued their steady rumble. Fuel consumption remained within normal parameters, and all aircraft systems were functioning properly. These were proven warhorses that had carried countless pilots through Pacific combat operations. Mechanical failure was not contributing to Flight 19's crisis. The problem was purely one of navigation and human decision-making under extreme stress. Fort Lauderdale's control tower was monitoring the situation with growing concern. Radio operators were receiving intermittent transmissions from Flight 19, but the combination of distance, weather interference, and Cuban radio broadcasts made clear communication increasingly difficult. Controllers could hear enough to understand that the flight was experiencing navigation problems, but not enough to provide effective assistance or guidance. The base's standard emergency procedures called for immediate dispatch of search and rescue aircraft when training flights reported difficulties. But Flight 19's situation was unique. They weren't reporting mechanical problems or immediate danger, just navigation uncertainty. The decision of when to launch rescue assets involved balancing the risk to additional aircraft against the severity of the reported emergency. As 16:30 approached, Flight 19 had been airborne for 2 hours and 20 minutes. With 6 hours of fuel capacity, they still had adequate reserves for extended flight time or navigation corrections. But every minute spent flying in the wrong direction was taking them further from safety, consuming fuel they might need for the return journey. The radio crackled again with Taylor's voice, now carrying a tone of growing uncertainty that contrasted sharply with his confident departure from Fort Lauderdale just hours earlier. His next transmission would reveal the full extent of their navigational confusion and set the stage for decisions that would seal Flight 19's fate. What was Lieutenant Taylor about to announce that would transform uncertainty into crisis and send Flight 19 toward their final destination in the darkening Atlantic. At 1724 Eastern Standard Time, Lieutenant Taylor's voice carried a new edge of desperation. "We'll fly 270 degrees west until landfall, or we run out of gas." Then, minutes later, he reversed course entirely, a decision that would scatter doubt through the formation like shrapnel. These course reversals marked the moment when experience and training gave way to panic, turning Flight 19's navigation crisis into a death spiral that would consume 14 lives. The weather had transformed, from challenging to dangerous. Fast-moving squall lines now dominated the sky, their dark cores pregnant with turbulence and blinding precipitation. Lightning flickered within the towering cumulus formations, creating electromagnetic interference that further disrupted radio communications and compass readings. Wind shear between different altitude layers was tossing the Avengers like toys, making precise formation flying nearly impossible. Visibility had deteriorated to less than 5 miles in many directions, with scattered rain showers creating walls of gray that could hide entire islands or land masses. The ocean below had turned from blue to slate gray, its surface whipped into whitecaps by winds that now exceeded 50 miles per hour at sea level. For pilots accustomed to the relatively calm training environment around Fort Lauderdale, these conditions represented the most severe weather they had ever encountered. Taylor's decision to fly due west reflected a fundamental shift in mission priorities. No longer was this navigation problem number only a structured training exercise with specific waypoints and procedures. This had become a survival situation where the primary goal was reaching any landfall before fuel exhaustion forced them into the Atlantic. The 270-degree heading would take them toward the Florida Peninsula, but from their uncertain position, it was impossible to calculate exactly where that course would lead. The student pilots following Taylor faced an agonizing dilemma. Military training and protocol demanded they maintain formation discipline and follow their leader's instructions without question. But each of them was simultaneously trying to navigate independently, and their calculations might not match Taylor's assessment of their position. Radio chatter revealed growing disagreement within the formation about their true location and the best course of action. One transmission captured the mounting tension. "I don't know where we are. We must have gotten lost after that last turn." The voice belonged to one of the student pilots, his professional composure cracking under the strain of flying in deteriorating weather while following potentially incorrect navigation guidance. These young men had trained for months to reach this point, but nothing in their instruction had prepared them for this combination of equipment failure, severe weather, and command uncertainty. The Avenger aircraft themselves were beginning to show the strain of extended flight in rough conditions. Fuel consumption had increased due to the turbulence and frequent course changes, reducing their available flight time and limiting options for extended searches or navigation corrections. Engine temperatures were running higher than normal as the Wright R2600 radials worked harder to maintain airspeed in the increasingly violent air. While still well within operational parameters, these factors added another layer of pressure to an already critical situation. Fort Lauderdale's control tower was now fully engaged in emergency procedures. Radio operators were attempting to establish clear communication with Flight 19 while simultaneously coordinating with other military installations and rescue services. The base's radar was operating at maximum range, trying to locate the missing formation among the weather returns and electronic interference that filled their scopes. But 1945 technology had severe limitations. Radar coverage was spotty at best, and atmospheric conditions could create false returns or mask actual aircraft. The time factor was becoming critical. Flight 19 had now been airborne for more than 3 hours, consuming approximately half their fuel capacity. Even with 6-hour endurance, the margin for error was shrinking rapidly. Every course change and navigation correction burned precious fuel that might be needed for the final approach to safety. Military planners calculated that the formation would reach minimum fuel reserves sometime after 1900 hours, less than 2 hours away. At 1745, Taylor made his second course reversal, announcing a new heading that contradicted his previous westward decision. This change revealed the extent of his navigational uncertainty and created chaos within the formation. Student pilots who had been following his lead while maintaining their own dead reckoning plots now faced contradictory information that made any coherent navigation impossible. Some aircraft began to lag behind as pilots hesitated to follow what seemed like increasingly erratic leadership. The psychological pressure within the cockpits was becoming unbearable. These crews had started the day expecting routine training that would advance their careers and bring them closer to fleet assignment. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a nightmare scenario that exceeded their training and experience. Radio transmissions carried increasing evidence of stress voices that had been calm and professional at takeoff, now betrayed fear and confusion. Darkness was also approaching with December's early sunset. At 1800 hours, the sun would disappear below the horizon, leaving Flight 19 to navigate by instruments alone in what promised to be a stormy night. Night flying over water without reliable navigation equipment represented the most challenging conditions possible for student pilots. Even experienced aviators found night water operations difficult. For these young men, darkness would transform their crisis into an almost impossible situation. The radio crackled again with Taylor's voice, now stripped of the confidence that had characterized his earlier transmissions. His words carried the weight of command responsibility, mixed with growing desperation as he struggled to lead his formation to safety. The next hour would bring increasingly desperate attempts to find landfall before fuel exhaustion forced a water landing in the stormy Atlantic. But as 1800 hours approached, and the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Flight 19's window of opportunity was rapidly closing. Their next transmission would reveal just how desperate their situation had become. What would happen when darkness fell over the lost formation? And why would their final radio call become one of the most haunting messages in aviation history? The sun touched the horizon at 1800 hours, painting the storm clouds in shades of orange and red before surrendering the Atlantic to complete darkness. Somewhere in that vast expanse of black water and violent weather, 5 Avengers continued their desperate search for home. This transition from day to night marked the point of no return after this moment. Flight 19 would be navigating by instruments alone through conditions that would challenge even the most experienced aviators. The weather had reached truly dangerous proportions. Squall lines now stretched across hundreds of square miles, their towering thunderheads reaching 40,000 feet into the atmosphere. Lightning strobed continuously within the storm cells, creating electromagnetic pulses that disrupted radio communications and rendered compass readings even more unreliable. Rain fell in sheets so heavy that it reduced visibility to near zero, while turbulence tossed the Avengers through altitude changes that stressed both aircraft and crew. Lieutenant Taylor's voice came through the static with increasing frequency, each transmission revealing another layer of their deteriorating situation. The confident formation leader who had departed Fort Lauderdale had been replaced by a pilot struggling with equipment failures, severe weather, and the crushing responsibility of leading 13 other men through the most dangerous flying conditions any of them had ever encountered. His combat experience, which should have been an asset, seemed inadequate for this particular crisis. The student pilots following Taylor faced their own mounting challenges. Night flying over water required skills they had practiced in controlled environments around Fort Lauderdale, but never in weather this severe or with such unreliable navigation equipment. Each pilot was simultaneously trying to maintain formation position, monitor his instruments, navigate independently, and cope with turbulence that made every control input a struggle. The cognitive workload was overwhelming for aviators with just 300 total flight hours. Radio chatter between the aircraft had evolved from professional communication to desperate exchanges of increasingly contradictory information. Compass readings varied between aircraft. Dead reckoning calculations produced different position estimates, and visual references had disappeared entirely into the stormy darkness. Each crew member was essentially flying his own version of Flight 19's mission, following slightly different navigation solutions toward what they hoped was the same destination. The Avenger aircraft themselves were performing admirably despite the extreme conditions. The Wright R-2000-600 engines continued their steady operation, though fuel consumption had increased significantly due to the constant maneuvering required in turbulent air. Airframes designed for carrier operations and combat stress were handling the weather without structural problems, but the human crews inside were approaching their limits of endurance and skill. Fuel calculations had become critical. Flight 19 had now been airborne for more than 4 hours, consuming approximately 2/3 of their total fuel capacity. Even if they located Fort Lauderdale immediately, fuel reserves were approaching minimum levels for safe landing. Any additional navigation errors or course corrections would push them into emergency fuel status, where forced water landing became increasingly likely. The psychological pressure within the formation was reaching breaking point. Radio transmissions captured increasing evidence of stress and fear as the reality of their situation became undeniable. These young men had volunteered for naval aviation, expecting adventure and career advancement, not a survival situation that exceeded their training and experience. The weight of that realization was evident in every hesitant transmission and uncertain response. Fort Lauderdale's emergency response was now operating at maximum capacity. Every available radio operator was monitoring frequencies used by Flight 19, while radar operators scanned their scopes for any sign of the missing formation. Base commanders had initiated contact with other military installations throughout Florida and the Bahamas, creating a communication network that might provide navigation assistance if clear contact could be established. But the technical limitations of 1945 technology were becoming painfully apparent. Radio direction finding equipment, which might have provided bearing information to help Flight 19 navigate home, was ineffective due to atmospheric interference and the formation's uncertain position. Radar coverage had significant gaps, especially at low altitudes over water, where weather returns masked aircraft signatures. The rescue infrastructure that would develop in later decades simply didn't exist. At 1845, Taylor announced another course change, this time toward what he believed might be the direction of the Florida Keys. This decision reflected his continued conviction that Flight 19 had somehow ended up far south of their intended position, despite dead reckoning calculations that suggested they should be northeast of Fort Lauderdale. The contradiction between his position estimate and basic navigation principles would puzzle investigators for decades. The formation was beginning to show signs of dissolution. Student pilots, faced with conflicting navigation information and deteriorating weather, were finding it increasingly difficult to maintain tight formation position. Some aircraft had fallen behind as pilots reduced airspeed to conserve fuel, while others had moved ahead in attempts to escape the worst turbulence. What had started as a precision formation was evolving into a loose gaggle of aircraft, following roughly similar headings toward an uncertain destination. Time was running out. Military flight planners calculated that Flight 19 would reach minimum fuel reserves sometime after 1900 hours, leaving them with perhaps 30 minutes of flight time before forced water landing became inevitable. Every minute spent flying in the wrong direction reduced their chances of survival and increased the area that rescue forces would need to search. The radio crackled again with Taylor's voice, now carrying undertones of resignation mixed with determination. His next transmission would reveal the full extent of their fuel crisis and set the stage for Flight 19's final, haunting message to the world. What words would Lieutenant Taylor speak into the darkness that would become aviation's most chilling epitaph, and why would they mark the beginning rather than the end of the night's tragedy? At 19:04 Eastern Standard Time, Lieutenant Taylor's voice emerged from the static one last time, carrying words that would echo through aviation history. All planes close up tight. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together. The transmission faded into darkness, leaving only the whisper of static where 14 voices had once been. This final message transformed Flight 19 from a missing training flight into a tragedy that would haunt the Navy for generations, and it was only the beginning of the night's horrors. The silence that followed Taylor's last transmission was deafening. Radio operators at Fort Lauderdale stared at their equipment, hoping for another burst of communication that never came. The words themselves carried a terrible finality in gallons, represented perhaps 15 minutes of flight time for an Avenger operating at minimum power settings. Taylor's decision to keep the formation together until the end reflected both military discipline and the grim reality that scattered aircraft would be impossible to locate in the stormy darkness. Base commanders at Fort Lauderdale faced an immediate crisis. Standard emergency procedures called for launching rescue aircraft as quickly as possible, but the weather conditions that had doomed Flight 19 posed equally serious threats to any rescue attempt. Visibility was near zero. Winds exceeded safe limits for many aircraft types, and the electromagnetic disturbances that had disrupted Flight 19's radios would affect rescue operations as well. The decision-making process revealed the human cost of command responsibility. Officers who had spent the evening monitoring Flight 19's deteriorating situation now had to balance the slim chance of successful rescue against the certainty of additional casualties if rescue aircraft were lost. Every minute of delay reduced the possibility that Flight 19's crews could survive a water landing, but rushing into the same conditions that had claimed the original formation would likely create additional tragedies. At 1915, base operations made a fateful decision that would define their response to the crisis. The installation's ready plane, a fully fueled and equipped Avenger maintained for immediate emergency response, was ordered to remain on the ground. Flight operations officers determined that conditions were too dangerous to risk additional aircraft and crew in what was likely already a hopeless situation. This decision, while logical from a safety standpoint, meant that any rescue attempt would have to come from external sources. Instead, emergency coordinators began contacting other military installations throughout Florida and the Caribbean, requesting immediate assistance from any aircraft capable of operating in severe weather conditions. The Coast Guard received priority notification, as their crews had extensive experience with overwater search and rescue operations. Seaplane squadrons were also contacted, as flying boats might have better survival prospects if forced down in rough seas. The response was immediate and comprehensive. Within 30 minutes of Flight 19's final transmission, rescue coordination centers from Miami to Jacksonville were mobilizing every available asset. Weather reconnaissance aircraft were diverted from routine missions to survey conditions over the search area. Ships in the vicinity received emergency broadcasts, requesting assistance with search operations. The machinery of military rescue was grinding into motion with impressive speed and coordination. But the night had one more tragedy in store. At 1927, a Martin PBM-5 Mariner flying boat, designated Trainer 49, lifted off from Naval Air Station Banana River just north of Cape Canaveral. The massive twin-engine seaplane carried 13 crew members, a pilot, co-pilot, navigator, flight engineer, and 9 additional personnel assigned to search and rescue operations. Their mission was to conduct an immediate search of the area where Flight 19 was believed to have gone down. The PBM-5 Mariner was an ideal choice for this mission. Its twin Pratt Whitney R2800 engines provided the power needed to operate in rough weather, while its flying boat design offered the possibility of water landing and takeoff if rescue survivors were located. The aircraft's long-range capability and extensive radio equipment made it well-suited for extended search operations over vast areas of ocean. Most importantly, its crew had specific training in search and rescue procedures and night-over-water operations. Trainer 49's takeoff proceeded normally despite the challenging conditions. The Mariner's pilot, experienced in night flying and adverse weather operations, successfully got the massive aircraft airborne and began climbing toward the search area. Radio contact with Banana River remained clear during the initial phases of flight, with the crew reporting normal aircraft performance and their progress toward the designated search zone. But at 1950, just 23 minutes after takeoff, something went catastrophically wrong. The SS Gaines Mills, a merchant tanker operating approximately 20 miles northeast of Fort Lauderdale, reported seeing a brilliant explosion on the horizon. Crew members described a fireball that rose nearly 100 feet above the ocean surface, followed by a spreading oil slick that reflected the flames in the darkness. The explosion lasted only seconds, but its intensity was visible from more than 10 miles away. Radio operators at Banana River attempted to re-establish contact with Trainer 49, but received only silence. The aircraft's last transmission had been routine a position report and weather update that gave no indication of mechanical problems or emergency conditions. Like Flight 19 before it, the Mariner had simply vanished from the sky without warning or explanation. The loss of Trainer 49 doubled the night's death toll from 14 to 27 men, transforming a single training accident into a disaster that would shock the Navy to its core. Two separate aircraft, operating under different conditions and with different experience levels, had vanished within hours of each other over the same general area of the Atlantic. The coincidence seemed impossible, yet the evidence was undeniable. Emergency coordinators now faced a crisis of unprecedented scope. Not only had they lost Flight 19's 5 Avengers and 14 crew members, but their first rescue attempt had claimed an additional aircraft and 13 more lives. The weather conditions that had contributed to both losses showed no signs of improvement, making immediate follow-up rescue attempts equally dangerous. The SS Gaines Mills report of the explosion provided the first concrete evidence of what had happened to either missing formation, but it raised as many questions as it answered. Mariner flying boats were known for their structural integrity and safety record. Catastrophic explosions during normal flight operations were extremely rare. Yet the tanker's crew had witnessed something that could only be described as a massive airborne explosion, followed by debris hitting the ocean's surface. As midnight approached on December 5th, 1945, the scope of the disaster was becoming clear. The largest peacetime search and rescue operation in Navy history was about to begin, involving hundreds of aircraft, dozens of ships, and thousands of personnel across multiple states and nations. But would this massive effort succeed where the night's rescue attempts had failed so tragically? Dawn broke gray and ominous over the Atlantic on December 6th, revealing an ocean that stretched endlessly in all directions. 200,000 square miles of churning water that might hold the answers to aviation's newest mystery, or might hold nothing at all. What began at sunrise would become the largest peacetime search and rescue operation in naval history. A massive effort that would ultimately raise more questions than it answered. The command structure established overnight at Fort Lauderdale resembled a wartime operations center. Officers from multiple branches of service clustered around plotting tables covered with charts of the Florida coast, the Bahamas, and the vast Atlantic expanse between them. Radio operators manned frequencies around the clock, coordinating with aircraft and ships across hundreds of miles of ocean. The scope of the operation reflected both the Navy's determination to find its missing men and the growing realization that this incident transcended normal search and rescue procedures. By 0600 hours, the first search aircraft were already airborne. Coast Guard PBY Catalinas, with their long-range capability and experienced overwater crews, began systematic searches of the areas where Flight 19 might have gone down. Navy patrol bombers joined the effort, their radar operators scanning the ocean surface for any sign of debris or survivors. Even Army Air Force's aircraft were diverted to the search, creating an unprecedented level of inter-service cooperation. The search pattern itself was a masterpiece of military planning. Coordinators divided the potential search area into grid squares, assigning specific aircraft to cover each sector using overlapping flight paths that ensured no area went unexamined. Photo reconnaissance aircraft documented anything that might be debris, while rescue-equipped seaplanes maintained readiness to investigate any promising contacts. Ships positioned themselves at strategic intervals to provide navigation references and serve as rescue platforms if survivors were located. Weather remained a constant challenge. The same frontal system that had contributed to Flight 19's loss continued to generate severe conditions across much of the search area. Squall lines forced aircraft to deviate from planned search patterns, while rough seas made debris spotting nearly impossible from normal search altitudes. Pilots reported visibility that varied from excellent to near zero within the span of minutes, as scattered thunderstorms continued to develop throughout the region. The statistics were staggering. By the end of the first day, 47 aircraft had flown 112 search sorties covering over 30,000 square miles of ocean. Coast Guard cutters, Navy destroyers, and civilian vessels joined the surface search, their crews scanning the horizon for any sign of the missing aircraft. Amateur radio operators throughout Florida monitored emergency frequencies, hoping to hear distress signals from survivors who might have reached life rafts or remote islands. But despite this massive effort, the ocean yielded no secrets. Aircraft that should have left debris fields visible from miles away had apparently vanished without trace. Life rafts that should have deployed automatically during water landings were nowhere to be found. Even oil slicks, which would mark the location of crashed aircraft for days after impact, failed to materialize in the search areas. The absence of debris became increasingly puzzling as the search expanded. Military aircraft of the 1940s were not designed to disappear completely upon water impact. Avengers, in particular, contained numerous components that would float life rafts, seat cushions, fuel tanks, and various pieces of equipment made from cork, rubber, or lightweight metals. The total absence of any floating debris from 5 large aircraft defied both logic and experience. Search aircraft also investigated reports from civilian witnesses who claimed to have seen or heard aircraft in distress. A fishing boat captain reported hearing engines that sounded like they were in trouble sometime after 2000 hours on December 5th, but could provide no specific location due to the darkness and rough weather. Residents of remote Bahamian islands reported hearing aircraft sounds during the night, but subsequent searches of those areas revealed nothing. The psychological toll on search crews was becoming evident. Pilots who had volunteered enthusiastically for the mission were beginning to show signs of strain after hours of staring at empty ocean. The repetitive nature of search patterns, combined with the emotional weight of knowing that 27 fellow servicemen were missing, created stress levels that commanders hadn't anticipated. Some crews reported seeing debris or survivors that turned out to be floating logs, patches of seaweed, or optical illusions created by wind and waves. On December 7th, the search expanded to include inland areas of Florida. Coordinators theorized that Flight 19 might have reached the mainland and crashed in the Everglades, a vast wilderness where aircraft could disappear beneath the canopy of vegetation and remain hidden for years. Army Air Force's aircraft, equipped with ground-scanning radar, joined the effort, flying systematic patterns over thousands of square miles of swampland and forest. The Everglades search presented unique challenges. The dense vegetation made visual spotting nearly impossible, while radar returns from trees and standing water created thousands of false contacts that required individual investigation. Ground teams struggled through terrain that ranged from knee-deep water to impenetrable thickets, following up on radar contacts that invariably proved to be natural features rather than crashed aircraft. Civilian participation in the search effort was remarkable. Private pilots throughout Florida volunteered their aircraft in time to join the military search, while fishing boats and pleasure craft combed coastal waters. Amateur radio operators maintained continuous monitoring of emergency frequencies, creating a communication network that supplemented official channels. The public response reflected both the human drama of 27 missing servicemen and the growing mystique surrounding their disappearance. By December 10th, 5 days after Flight 19's disappearance, the search effort involved 248 aircraft, 18 ships, and thousands of personnel. The geographic scope had expanded to cover areas from the Carolinas to Cuba, encompassing virtually every location where the missing aircraft might conceivably have ended up. Search patterns had been refined multiple times based on new theories about Flight 19's possible track. But each refinement produced the same result: nothing. The Coast Guard's role in the search was particularly significant. Their crews had extensive experience with overwater rescues and understood the behavior of debris in various sea conditions. Coast Guard analysts calculated drift patterns based on known currents and wind conditions, predicting where floating debris should appear if aircraft had crashed in specific areas. Yet even these scientifically based predictions failed to produce any trace of the missing Avengers. As the search entered its second week, commanders faced increasingly difficult decisions about resource allocation and operational priorities. The massive effort was consuming enormous quantities of fuel, aircraft, flight hours, and personnel time that would normally be devoted to other military requirements. The families of the missing men deserved every possible effort to locate their loved ones. But military leadership also had to consider the practical limitations of indefinite search operations. The question that haunted every briefing room and planning session was becoming unavoidable. How could 5 large aircraft and 27 men vanish so completely from the face of the Earth? What would it take to finally call off the greatest search in naval history? And what legacy would Flight 19 leave for future generations? Section 8. Complete. Awaiting. Continue. Plotted. Final section's narrative arc and cultural impact. Vibes. Now I need to write the final section. Section 9. Based on the research notes and the story's progression, this section should cover the end of the search operation, the official investigation and its conclusions, the controversy around the initial blame on Taylor versus the later cause unknown ruling, the broader context of training casualties at NAS Fort Lauderdale. 94 men died from 1,942-46. The birth of the Bermuda Triangle legend, the lasting mystery, and its impact. The section should hook. The moment they called off the search, stakes. What this meant for the families and the Navy. Core narrative. Investigation, blame, controversy, broader context. Pattern interrupts. Statistics, specific details about the base, the one survivor, Cosnar. Re-engagement. Questions about the lasting mystery. Final close. The enduring legacy. I need to maintain the documentary thriller tone while providing closure to the story and connecting it to its larger cultural impact. Section 9. The mystery that refuses to die. On December 19th, 1945, 14 days after Flight 19's final transmission, Navy commanders made the decision that no one wanted to make. The search was officially called off, leaving 27 families without answers and creating a mystery that would outlive everyone who witnessed it. This moment marked not just the end of the greatest peacetime search in naval history, but the birth of a legend that would transform a tragic training accident into one of the world's most enduring, unexplained phenomena. The statistics were sobering in their completeness. 248 aircraft had flown over 3,000 sorties, covering more than 200,000 square miles of ocean, swampland, and coastal territory. 18 ships had searched surface waters from the Carolinas to Cuba. Thousands of military personnel and civilian volunteers had devoted weeks to the effort. The financial cost approached $1 million, an enormous sum in 1945 currency. Yet for all this unprecedented effort, not a single confirmed piece of debris had been recovered from any of the missing aircraft. The official investigation began even as search operations continued. A board of inquiry, convened under Navy regulations governing aircraft accidents, faced the unusual challenge of investigating disasters where no physical evidence existed. Without wreckage to examine or survivors to interview, investigators had to reconstruct the events leading to Flight 19's loss using only radio transcripts, weather reports, and testimony from personnel who had monitored the flight from Fort Lauderdale. The initial findings were controversial and would remain so for decades. The board's preliminary report placed primary responsibility on Lieutenant Charles Taylor, citing mental aberration as the cause of the navigation errors that led to the flight's loss. This conclusion reflected the investigation's focus on Taylor's radio transmissions, which revealed his confusion about the formation's position and his decision to make multiple course changes that took them further from safety. The mental aberration finding devastated Taylor's family and sparked immediate controversy within naval aviation circles. Taylor's mother, Beulah Taylor, launched a determined campaign to clear her son's name, arguing that equipment failure rather than pilot error had caused the tragedy. Her efforts, supported by fellow aviators who respected Taylor's combat record and experience, would eventually force the Navy to reconsider its conclusions. The broader context of training operations at Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale revealed disturbing patterns that the Flight 19 investigation brought into sharp focus. From 1942 to 1946, 94 men had died in Avenger training accidents at this single installation. Flight 19's 14 crew members represented the final entries in a casualty list that reflected the dangerous reality of accelerated wartime pilot training. Base life during the war years had been characterized by relentless pressure to process pilots through training as quickly as possible. 3,600 personnel crammed into facilities designed for far fewer, enduring Florida's brutal humidity while maintaining aircraft that were often pushed beyond normal operational limits. Link trainer sessions in windowless black boxes prepared pilots for instrument flying, but couldn't replicate the psychological pressure of actual navigation emergencies over open water. The human cost of this training pipeline was epitomized by one man who wasn't aboard Flight 19. Corporal Alan Cosner had been originally assigned to the mission as a student gunner, but requested permission that morning to skip the flight and catch up on paperwork. His supervisor granted the requested decision that saved Cosner's life and made him the sole survivor of what should have been a 15-man crew. For the rest of his life, Cosner would carry the weight of being the only man originally slated for Flight 19 who lived to tell about it. The Avenger aircraft themselves had earned formidable reputations during the Pacific War. These single-engine torpedo bombers had participated in every major naval engagement from Midway to the Philippines, earning respect for their ruggedness and reliability. The deep, rhythmic growl of their Wright R-2600 engines had become synonymous with American naval power. Pilots described the sensory experience of flying Avengers: the chest-rattling engine vibration, the sweet acrid smell of high-octane fuel, the feel of massive control surfaces responding to their inputs as the Cyclone's war song. Yet for all their combat-proven reliability, Avengers remained complex machines that demanded respect and skill. Navigation equipment was primitive by later standards, requiring pilots to master dead reckoning techniques that left little margin for error over featureless ocean. The combination of limited instrumentation, severe weather, and inexperienced crews had created conditions that even the most reliable aircraft couldn't overcome. In 1947, pressure from Taylor's family and supporters within the Navy forced a review of the original investigation findings. The review board, examining the same evidence but with different perspectives, reached a dramatically different conclusion. Taylor's mental aberration designation was removed, and the official cause of Flight 19's loss was changed to cause unknown. This revision acknowledged that equipment failure, severe weather, and other factors beyond pilot control might have contributed to the tragedy. The cause unknown designation would prove prophetic. Flight 19's disappearance, combined with the loss of Trainer 49 during the rescue attempt, began to generate speculation that went far beyond conventional accident investigation. The complete absence of debris, the mysterious explosion witnessed by the SS Gaines Mills, and the failure of the massive search effort to find any trace of 27 men and 6 aircraft created fertile ground for alternative theories. Early references to unusual phenomena in the area appeared in aviation publications and popular magazines throughout the late 1940s. Writers began connecting Flight 19's disappearance with other unexplained incidents in the same general area, creating the foundation for what would eventually become known as the Bermuda Triangle legend. The transformation of a tragic training accident into supernatural mystery reflected post-war America's fascination with unexplained phenomena and conspiracy theories. The families of the 27 missing men faced a particularly cruel form of grief. Without bodies to bury or confirm details about their loved ones' final moments, they were left with questions that would never be answered. Some found solace in the Navy's eventual acknowledgement that equipment failure rather than pilot error might have caused the tragedy. Others continued to search for explanations that might provide closure to losses that defied understanding. The Flight 19 mystery endures because it represents something larger than a single training accident. It embodies the fundamental human struggle to comprehend the incomprehensible, to find meaning in tragedy, and to accept that some questions may never have answers. The disappearance of 14 young men on a routine training flight reminds us that even in an age of technology,